Lora-Marie Bernard is an award-winning crime, public affairs, and investigative journalist whose Texas nonfiction focuses on the state's resources and historical figures. She's also the author of Lower Brazos River Canals with Arcadia Publishing. Her leadership efforts were recognized by First Lady Laura Bush in the White House Preserve America initiative when she co-led a community team to preserve an undervalued historic neighborhood. Early in her journalism career, she was the recipient of the Robert F. Kennedy Award, and she was also a national award-winning communications and events director. Please join me in welcoming Lora-Marie Bernard.
Thank you. You sure that was me? Okay, thank you so much, guys, for coming and to hear my story tonight. I'm going to tell you a little bit before we get started about the book and how it came to be, because that's a story in and of itself. Matt mentioned that I had done the Lower Brazos River Canals. While I was doing that book, I was studying the plantation system along the Brazos River, and the guys at the Brazoria County Historical Museum kept yapping in my ear about this guy called Monroe Edwards, and it was really getting somewhat irritating because every time I went down there to look at the photos, to do the research, they kept yapping at me about this guy named Monroe Edwards and this plantation that he was involved with called Chenango. So I said, look, I'm going to finish this book, and if I get a chance, I'm going to think about it, and I'll see whether or not I really want to do a story about this guy. So it was about 6 months later, and I said, this Monroe guy keeps flopping around in my head, and this idea of swindling a plantation and all of that. So I started looking into him, and the more I looked into him, the more fascinated I got with how he did his crime spree. So I called up Arcadia, which by this point had purchased History Press, which made them the largest publishing firm in the United States. The largest, but they do regional publications like this one, where they want a small story about a local figure. So with that, that's how I ended up learning how someone actually swindles a plantation. So you might say, can someone actually swindle a plantation? And I'm going to tell you, yes, they can. The way you do that is first you need to have somebody who really knows how to counterfeit very, very well. And you need to have someone who is a very prolific and excellent human trafficker. And you need to have a partner who is just as interested in making money off of human trafficking as you do. So, who does that? And that would be Monroe Edwards. So before I go any much further, I want to tell you that this is the quintessential picture of Monroe Edwards. Okay, so keep that in your mind as I'm telling the story. But these pictures that I'll be showing you are pictures that come from the 1800s during a time called the Penny Dreadful. The Penny Dreadfuls came out around 1890, 1900, before comic books did, and they were huge stories about real figures in Texas history, national history. And they did stories about Monroe Edwards. And they actually drew pictures of his life. So all of the pictures in the book are pictures from the actual Penny Dreadfuls from the 1800s. There's maybe one or two that come from the museum just to show you a picture of Chenango, but the pictures that you'll be seeing in here are in the book, and they're all from the 1800s. The reason that the guys at the museum were so excited about Monroe is because he was a huge Penny Dreadful figure. And so when I started doing my research on him, they handed me those Penny Dreadfuls. So it took me a long time because they're kind of like reality TV. There's enough fact that you can create a fiction out of it. So I had to unravel the Penny Dreadfuls and get into what was for real. And the story that is in the book has some of those parts of the Penny Dreadful that I felt like I could trust. And the rest of it is legitimate academic primary source type of research, okay? So if you have questions, you just let me know. So let's start with Monroe. Okay, here's an interesting thing about Monroe. Monroe did not start off as a bad boy. His grandfather was the American Revolution. He was an American Revolution soldier. He stayed at the Cumberland Gap, and he protected it from American Indians, okay? So afterwards, the government gives him lots and lots of land, saying, thank you so much, thank you for not letting the Indians take us over. And with that, he becomes very successful. He has apple groves, he has peach groves, he has flour mills, he has all kinds of things. He makes a lot of money. He also became very involved with helping Kentucky become a state. He was one who signed the Declaration of the statehood for Kentucky. He was elected as the first U.S. Senator from Kentucky. He was a lauded, wonderful guy, and then for some reasons unknown, he abandons his family. He takes his slave mistress. They go across the Mason-Dixon line. He gets her emancipated, and he has an entire family with her. When he dies, I don't even think Monroe ever knew him. Monroe was born right after he died. But whether he did or not, what happened with his uncles is they went to a place called Mississippi. And while they were down in Mississippi, they met a guy named Stephen F. Austin. And Stephen F. Austin said, you know, my dad died, and he was talking to the Mexican government about settling this place called Tejas. I really want to finish that dream, but I don't have any money. Will you help me? So Monroe's uncles help him go down to Mexico. They fund his trip. Once Stephen F. Austin gets set up, they leave. He leaves, and he leaves the uncles there in Mexico. While the uncles are in Mexico, they do a lot to negotiate for the United States and for Austin these immigration laws that allowed the settlers from the United States to come into Texas. So this is his background. In the meantime, his dad is still up in Kentucky. And his dad is trying to get together a land association because he knows what they're doing. And he wants to bring Kentucky people down to Texas. So anyone who has a background in Kentucky or had ancestors from Kentucky, yes, you do.
What year was this?
This was 1830s, somewhere in there. But his father is not successful. And that's a part that's in the book that we're not going to get into because there's so many parts of this that we could talk about all night. But I'll be happy to talk to you about how his father tried to come down. And then in the long run, Austin actually swindles his father and gets the land that his father wanted to settle. But Austin still figures into this story with Amos and the Kentucky people, okay? So anyway, yes, so here we go. Let's move on to something interesting for you. Okay, here's some rebel rousers. This picture? Everybody knows this picture, right? If you don't know this picture, you're not from Texas. That's okay, I'll tell you who it is if you don't know. So anyway, Monroe has a bestie. Monroe's uncles end up coming to Texas. And when they come to Texas, they end up in Nacogdoches. Now, by this point, Stephen F. Austin has already gone to the Brazos. He has started bringing in his old colony. And Monroe's uncles, Hayden and Benjamin, are in a place called Nacogdoches. And any of you know anything about Nacogdoches, that's a very bad place to be because there's terrible people out there, like the filibusters, there's the Jane Long guys, there's just a whole bunch of people who are just really the Badlands. And they don't get along very well with those guys, so they want to start their own country. And so they decided to start this place called Fredonia. And they go off and try to create this whole new country. The Mexican government is so upset with them and is ready to go over and shoot them all dead. And Stephen F. Austin steps in and basically says, please don't kill them, they're my friends. So the Mexican government does not kill Monroe's uncles, but by this point, his father is down from Kentucky. And his father is like, I cannot believe my brothers lost their minds and tried to start a new country inside Texas. So I really don't want to live here with them. I want to go off. I want to find some new land. So he goes to Stephen F. Austin, and Stephen F. Austin says, well, I have some land. I've never seen it. Can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay. I think it went dead. Oh, there it went. It came back. Okay, so he says to him, I've never seen this land, but you can buy it. So he buys it. He goes down to the property, and this is the property. It's the area we know today as San Leon in Texas City. Now, Texas City and San Leon is not a great place to have a plantation. In fact, you can't really have a plantation at Texas City and San Leon. Monroe's father is heartbroken, completely heartbroken. Now, it was really, really hard for me to figure out when, how Monroe figures into all of this, at what point does he come down from Kentucky, and that's all kind of in the book because he went to New Orleans for a while. But at some point in all of this, he is back with his father, and he is in Texas City, and he knows that his father is never going to have a plantation in this property. So Monroe's father, whose name is Amos, goes by the name Moses. And any of you who know out in Texas City, there's a little place out there called Moses' Lake. That is where I believed they had their tents and they lived. And they wrote back to Stephen F. Austin and said, look, I don't really think you would have sold me this property if you'd seen it. The best I can do is probably put some cattle on it. But I did have one guy from Kentucky who came down with me and my son-in-law. They need some property. I'd like to buy them the property that we know today as Dickinson and League City and Clear Lake. And he said, I'm going to send my son, Monroe, over to you, and he's going to finish the deal for me. So he did. Now, Monroe had a mentor, he was an apprentice to James Morgan, who many of you may know from Galveston history as the guy who was the commander for the Civil War, for Galveston. Morgan at some point really likes this idea of coming to Texas, so he goes ahead and gets the property on top of League City, which we know today is Morgan's Point. So because of this family, you have the entire west side of Galveston Bay now settled. So that's a very deep part of Texas. This is all done before the Texas Revolution. And it was all basically because Monroe's uncles tried to start their own country. Crazy, isn't it? Can you imagine sitting at night going, no, this can't be true. It took me 3 weeks to believe that story, but it worked. It's the truth. And today, if you are in city government, you will still, and you're dealing with the deeds and things, you'll still see people buying deeds from Amos Edwards League in Texas City. I actually saw one when I was working on the book. So that's an interesting part of our character when he was pretty decent. Now, the reason I'm telling you that story is so I can tell you this story. This is a really cool story. So, in the Fredonian Rebellion, Monroe's uncles have a friend. His name is Captain Dorset. After the Fredonian Rebellion, Captain Dorset takes in Monroe as a boarder. And when he's in there boarding with Captain Dorset, he has two roommates who he becomes best friends with. One is William B. Travis. The second is Patrick Jack. And they were the cat's meow. Okay, so William B. Travis was considered incredibly good looking. He was tall, he was blonde haired, he had blue eyes. Monroe, you saw the first picture of him. Monroe was tall, he had black hair, he had curls. Sometimes he let his little mustache come out and he would twirl it. And Patrick Jack, not so good looking, but he was incredibly intelligent. Everyone loved these guys. They were the impeccable manners. They were just wonderful to be around. When people saw them in town, they loved them. But they were also big rebel rousers. They absolutely did not want Mexico running Texas anymore. So, what does Mexico do? Well, Mexico had a trouble. Mexico had some big issues. First off, they had some immigrants who were not Roman Catholic like they were supposed to be. In fact, Monroe's family was not Roman Catholic. They were from Kentucky, which meant they were probably Baptist. Second of all, they didn't all read and write. Third, they weren't doing what they were told. Fourth, they were causing all kinds of trouble, like trying to create their own country and stuff. And fifth, they didn't pray to the Virgin Mary. And sixth, most of them didn't speak Spanish. So, when anybody talks to you about immigration problems in Texas, you can tell them it goes a lot further back than they ever thought it did. okay? So what they did in response to that is they did not build a wall. They didn't build a wall. They sent out these captains and colonels in the military to build forts. So there was a period in our history where the Mexican government were letting people go out and build forts. Well, one person, his name was Juan Bradburn. His real name was John. He was an American who was supporting the Mexicans. He went to a place called Anahuac, right down the road from us. And he built a fort. And on this fort, he had kilns. These are not the kilns from Anahuac because there's nothing left from Anahuac. So I took you some pictures of some kilns so you could see what they might look like. And so he used this to make bricks for the fort. And I've had people say to me, he made bricks. They had bricks back then. We thought all the forts were wooden, but no, they were making some bricks. They made bricks for forts. So he had one of those. He didn't have two, he had one. And so he's out there making his little fort up. And long story short, you can go into the book, but William B. Travis and Patrick Jack do not get along with this guy at all. And they try to trick him. And he gets so mad that he was being tricked that he throws them into one of these kilns, a kiln like this, okay? So they're in the kiln. Now, being in a kiln back then is not quite the same as being in jail today. When you're in a kiln, people can go in and talk to you. If you have a slave, the slave can come in and sit with you. People can come in and give you clothes and all kinds of things. So while they're in this kiln, they decide they want to get out because even though they can see people, it's still a kiln. And it's not a great place to be. So one day, they decide they're going to hatch a plan to escape. So they send out a secret code called OPQ. And in this little note to OPQ, it says, you need to be at this certain place at this certain time with this certain horse. We're going to show up and we're going to escape. Well, doesn't work. Instead, what happens is the prisoners find the letter and they give it to Juan Bradburn, who says, oh, no, 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 no. And this is great. This is my favorite part of the book. First off, it's because Monroe's not a criminal during this part. The second part of it is I got a lot of primary sources, and you cannot believe how this could be a Netflix series. This is what happens. He decides he's going to create this big ball, and everybody's going to get dressed up, and they're all going to come to the ball, and they're all going to be dancing around, and at a certain point, he's going to, like, pounce on them, and he's going to capture them all, and he's going to find out who OPQ is. Well, doesn't work, but it's a great part of the book, because everybody skedaddles, and it's just, people are giving weird looks at each other and everything. But the real person who was OPQ was not there. He was in Brazoria County. His name was Monroe Edwards. So Monroe gets back, comes in, everybody's like, oh my God, they're looking for OPQ. And he immediately goes, oh no, I'm OPQ. I don't know, maybe it was some little secret language they had, but he knew when he heard those three initials that they were trying to send him a message. So what he does is he writes back to Brazoria County and he says, you guys have got to come up here and help me get them out, because I'm going to be in the kiln before long. It's only a matter of time before Bradburn figures out I'm OPQ, and he's going to throw me in the kiln too for, supposedly helping them escape. That does happen, and they do end up in the kiln. Those of you who know the Anahuac story know that in the end, Brazoria does go up the river, goes up the bay. They bring the cannon, they get them out. They get all three of them out. They also get other people out, but those were the three people that are important to the story. So now they're out, and I don't know what happened at this point. They come back, they walk into town. Everybody in town is delighted to see them. Little kids are like, Mama, Mama, here they come. And Mother's like, shut up, kid, they're not coming. And then she turns around and she sees all three of them walking together. They sit down at Captain Dorset's house, they have dinner, they go to bed, and within a few weeks, they are no longer friends. William Travis goes on to become the person that we know him to be and to whom he became. Patrick Jack goes with his brother down to Brazoria and opens up a law firm, and Monroe stays and continues to work for James Morgan, who has an extensively successful store. And so I don't know what happened. Different people have thought that it had something to do with breaking Masonic trust or something, but there's nothing written that I could find that explains what happened to their friendship inside the kiln. All I know is that he never sees William B. Travis again, and when he sees Patrick Jack, it's not very pretty. So what happens? So after Anahuac, Monroe is walking around one day down in Galveston, minding his own business, and he sees a friend from his days in New Orleans, which I did not talk to you very much about because that's a whole nother story in the book. But he sees an old friend, and this old friend is a slaver. And he tells him that he can make money in the slave trade. Long story short, Monroe is one of the in fact, probably the only person that the academic world can pinpoint as a person who may have gone to Africa to actually pick up slaves. All the others went to Cuba, and they would get their slaves in Cuba and bring them over to Texas. So the reason Monroe started becoming a slaver is because there was a very, very short period of time in Texas history when Mexico, which never liked slavery, and they just kind of put up with it because they wanted to settle Texas. That was going on, but it was right before the Texas Revolution, right before all of that happened. So Monroe was smart enough to see that there would be probably 7 years where you could probably slave smuggle, make a lot of money between that time that Texas outlaws slavery and actually goes into a revolution. So there were probably 7 other guys who were doing this also. None of them went to Africa. They all went to Cuba, but Monroe was the most successful at this. He made more money than anybody. In fact, at one point, he was considered the most wealthy man in Texas after he got back from Africa with the slaves, because he bought them very, very cheaply, and then since he directly imported them and sold them, he made a lot of money on that, okay? So that begins his time of doing something just a little bit shady, but not really shady, because back then slavery wasn't as shady, but he was definitely a very successful human trafficker. It took me a long time to research this part of the book, and it was a very difficult part of the book to research, but I was able to find primary sources that were able to talk about being in Africa. These were basically English abolitionists, UK abolitionists, who were writing about the economy and how the economy worked in Africa and how the whole slave trade worked. And in that period, you actually find people who have written, Texas is going to be the next big slave state. We need to watch Texas. So that tells you that even back then, today, of course, we're always talking about the global economy, especially living here in Houston, but the idea of a global economy and Texas being very important to it goes all the way back to the slave route. Because they would watch Texas and they knew that eventually Texas would end up on Africa's shores. And it did, with Monroe Edwards. So if you're interested in knowing how that works, there's a whole section in the book about that. I go into actually even what some of those fortresses look like. If you ever saw the film Armistead, if you ever saw that, at the end where the English Navy goes and blows up a fortress, I believe that's the fortress Monroe was at. I believe he went into that fortress. And the guys that ran that fortress were very, very wealthy, and the British economy and the British bankers always wanted to do business with them. So during this period, you have the British banks looking at Texas as a place that they want to get their cash crops. They want to get their cotton, they want to get their tobacco, they want to get all kinds of stuff from Texas, because that's going to be the big new place. That's going to be the expansion of the South. So they're very interested in Texas for that reason. But they're also very interested in Texas because, they're interested in Texas for that. Let me back up. They're interested in Texas for that. But at the same time in Britain, you have a whole movement of abolitionists who are trying to shut that down. And that plays very importantly in the next part of Monroe's life. So I'm going to tell you how he started counterfeiting. Keep that in mind because that's going to become important later. So he's got this going on. He knows this is going to happen. He knows that there's a short period of time to become a slave smuggler. So his mom is like, on the other hand, I'm so sick of this place. I want to get out of it. So she says she wants to go to Mississippi. And he says, okay, I'll take you to Mississippi. So he goes to Mississippi with her. And along the way, he does business. He does some business. He sells some land to a guy from Florida, and because of that sale, that's a lot of the reason that Floridan settlers started coming over to Texas. And they never see each other again after they make their deal. But he also finds someone who knew how to counterfeit, and he did not tell anybody about this. He meets with this guy, and best I can tell from my research, they were supposed to use a mixture of chemicals. I know that we had bleach at this point in our history. What was new to this part of our history was benzene. And so I believe that they took bleach and benzene and kind of mixed them together. And then this is how he would do his deed. You would take a letter from someone, okay? And you would first off, you would protect the signature. And the rest of the letter you would lay in the chemicals. And then you would take it out and you would dry the paper. And it would be blank. So you ended up with this blank piece of paper with somebody's signature at the bottom of it. It was very important to keep the signature. And the reason for that is because people knew each other by their signatures. They didn't know each other by their writing. But if they saw a signature and they recognized it as the person it was supposed to be, they believed that whatever was written above it was legit. So now you have this empty piece of paper, and you had a very important signature at the bottom of it, and you could write whatever you wanted to write on the top of it. So Monroe perfected this. He didn't tell anybody about it, nobody knew, but he was quietly learning how to do this particular counterfeit technique. This is a picture from A Penny Dreadful of him trying to figure out the best way to counterfeit. So, when he is the most wealthy Texan ever, he buys a little place called Chenango. This is a little sketch from the Brazoria County Historical Museum. Okay? Now, Chenango became a very important part of his slave trade. He would use Chenango as a slave warehouse. And up until very recently, there was still a part of Chenango that still existed. It wasn't like a Verna Harg plantation. It was not restored or anything. It was just out there. Chenango itself has a very complicated history that's not even worth going into. But when Monroe was involved with it, he would bring his slaves there. And sometimes he would bring so many slaves in, he would lose them. Because, you know, if you're been taken from Africa, you end up in Cuba, you get on a ship, they're going to take you to Texas now, they're going to sell you again. By the time you reach Texas and the Brazos River, you're probably not real happy with what's happened to you, so you try to escape. And they would always escape. Imagine that. So that becomes another issue in Texas because people know that Monroe is doing slave smuggling. And they're not really trying to stop him. He's doing this through a loophole. But eventually, when the port authorities would find the slaves, they would take them to Chenango, where there was a slave warehouse going on. Okay? So along this way, on his trip to Mississippi, he meets a guy who, whose name is Christopher Dart. Now, if you're down in Brazoria County, or if you're anywhere around this area and you run across a Dart, there's a very good chance that they are a descendant of Christopher Dart. He was he eventually ended up with a very large legacy in this area. But at the time that he met Monroe, Monroe was trying to do business with him, and nothing interested him. He didn't want to do cotton. He didn't want to do anything that had to do with a store. He didn't want to do any land development. He didn't want to do any of the things that Monroe was doing. So Monroe said, you know, you could go into slaving with me. And Dart says, that sounds like a great idea. So he does. And he ends up backing all of Dart's. Dart ends up backing all of Monroe's loans. Now, without getting too down in the weeds with it, to be a slaver, you had to have a lot of money moving around all the time. I would liken it to trying to do a very large construction development here today. You know how contractors always have to have money moving around. They're waiting for somebody to pay them. They're waiting for somebody to invoice. They're waiting to get their money, and then they're waiting to pay somebody back. This is the same way slaving worked. Slaving, you would first get a loan from a bank, which at this point was probably a British bank that was using a Cuban bank as a front. And that's what happened with Monroe. There was a bank called the Marguerite Bank, and that bank in Cuba was a front for the British banks. And they loaned him all of his money to go slaving. So before he would make a trip, he would get his money out, and it would be a lot of money, and then they would also probably buy different things to trade along the way, so he might buy a cannon or something like that. But until you actually sold your slaves, you're now in debt to this bank. So Monroe sets this up where he's gotten a lot of money out. They've got slaves they have to sell. They've got slaves they got to go find. They've got slaves everywhere. They let somebody have a slave, and so they can pay them back later. You do get that I'm talking about humans as I'm talking about all of this. This is just crazy. So, but that's how it worked. And so Monroe sets this up and leaves it in the hands of Dart. So Dart is running this very complicated, lots of money happening kind of slave system. And Dart says, I'll take care of this. And Monroe goes, well, I'm going to go to England. And the reason he goes to England is because Monroe always wanted to be part of the British aristocracy. So he contacts different people in the United States, like Daniel Webster, other big names like that from our history, and they write letters of introduction to people in England. Again, he now has very important signatures with him, and he goes to England. He gives these letters of introduction to people like Princess Diana's ancestors, the Earl Spencer III. He gives these letters of introductions to the Duke of Wellington. He gives them to Queen Victoria's court. He is like the most wonderful person they've ever met from Texas, because at this time in our history, Britain thinks Texans are barbarians. They don't think they're very mannered. They don't think they're very attractive. They don't think they know anything about how to sit at a table. And in comes Monroe, who is basically a Jean Lafitte version of Texas. Very well-mannered, very attractive, very much like a businessman, knows all the best manners. So they start having parties for him. They have big parties for him, like at the Duke of Devonshire's home. They take him to the Queen Victoria's coronation. They take him to the coronation. He's having a great time. He ends up having a mistress. They call her the woman of the opera. He meets her at the opera, and they begin a torrid love affair. She's married, and all of a sudden, this great life, he pretends to be a Texas hero. He pretends to have been in all of these Texas battles. And of course, the only one he was ever involved with was the disturbance of Anahuac. But he basically tells William B. Travis's story and pretends to be William B. Travis. So that's the best way to say it. So anyway, he's having a great life over there until his brother writes him and says, you have got to get back here. You will not believe. Dart is walking around town saying that you left him high and dry. You have stolen money from him. You have taken him. He's completely wiped out. And Monroe's like, okay. So he says goodbye to all of his wonderful people. He says goodbye to his mistress of the opera. I'm sorry, that's where he's going to Europe. And this is when he's at the coronation. I should have been showing you all these pictures. Oh, there he meets the Duke of Wellington over there. And there he is living it up. I really wanted that picture to be the picture of the book, but they wouldn't go for it. And this is the one I wanted to show you. There he is saying goodbye to his mistress from the opera, who does not have a name. But she apparently was so distraught at the fact that he had to go back to take care of business, she gives him a very large diamond ring, which he just has to take. So there he said bye-bye. So, what happened? This is what happened. I'm going to go to the next one and see what happens. Okay. This is what happened. In 1837, Britain created an economic global collapse that was bigger than the economic collapse we just went through. It was bigger than the Depression. It was a very, very bad problem. Basically, they had created a bubble because you remember, I kept telling you, all this money had to run around to make all of this stuff work on this global economy that had been created from the slave route. And long story short, they had a bubble in commodities, and it burst. And when it burst, it created a domino effect in the United States. And this burst lasted 10 years. It took 10 years to recover from this. And when it dominoed into the United States, the reason it got worse, and I can't believe I'm saying this because when I was researching the book, this was not the case. But thank you, Donald Trump, because the president at the time was Andrew Jackson. So, thank you, Donald Trump. I didn't. But Andrew Jackson had some fiscal policies. He actually left office before the crash happened, but Daniel Webster followed him, and Daniel kept all of the same policies that were in place. And basically what America was trying to do at this time, they really wanted to get everybody go west. They were trying to do the West movement. So they created a national bank, and they actually let people, when they let money from the national bank, the gold went out to like Colorado, it went out to California. I mean, so the gold, when the crash happened and Britain started calling up all of their notes from everybody, there was nothing, because all the gold really was out in the mountains of the West. So this all works together with other things to create this major collapse. So while Monroe was in England being a phony William Travis and having affairs with opera people and being wined and dined by all of the aristocracy, Dart was back here trying to pay back the loan to the Marguerite Bank when the crash happened and they called in the loan. So my best guess, it was probably millions of dollars. Could have been 30, it could have been 300, but they owed money. And so he had to pay it out of his own pocket, and that's what made him mad about Monroe being gone. So Monroe comes back. Monroe is not worried at all. He's like, I don't know what he's talking about. I sold him Chenango. He's got Chenango, so this is not a problem. So he starts the trial, and this is the way it's set up. On Dart's side, Dart hires Patrick Jack's firm. I don't know why he did that. I don't know why Patrick Jack agreed to do it, but that's part of that. Something happened and they're not friends anymore. So he hires Patrick Jack's firm. This is very important right here. He puts up slaves as collateral because he has no money. One of the slaves is a girl named Kitty Clover. It's a very important name. Remember it. That's why it's in black, boldface. So, okay, Dart was the underdog because nobody over here really liked him. They all thought that he was lying and that Monroe was definitely in the clear on this whole thing because Dart had a history in Mississippi of not paying his debts, okay? So Monroe does hire some of the best attorneys and at that time, and the whole town is behind him, and they all show up at his trial to show support for him. The place was packed down there in Brazoria. Best I can tell, it's still the same area that the county courthouse is in today. And you can see where he's showing his brother the instruments of the forgery that no one knows about at this point. So here's how the trial goes. Dart gets up on the stand. Monroe's attorneys walk up to him. They show him a bill of sale. And Dart says, that's not my bill of sale. He gets very, very upset. He starts picking it up. This again is like a Netflix series. Picking it up, looking at it, turning it over. This is not my signature. This is not my signature. I did not do this. I don't know what you're talking about here. Then he says a very important phrase. Very, very important. He says, this is a forgery. Now, forgery is not the same thing as it is today. If you were found guilty of forgery, you were going to be hanged. So this was a very important and serious thing, and the whole place gasps. They can't believe it. Dart comes down. Monroe's attorneys call up his brother, Monroe's brother. Monroe's brother says, oh, absolutely, I saw Dart sign that thing. He's lying if he says that he didn't sign it. I was at the meeting where it happened. So Dart is by this point just really, really upset, and from all accounts he was visibly upset, just shaking and looking at the piece of paper, could not figure out what happened, and all of a sudden he says, I know what happened. This has to be a forgery because this paper is not the paper I use for financial documents. Now, this is another thing you need to know about paper. It's not like it was today. It's not just any old piece of paper. Back then you had onion skin paper, you had thick paper, you had thin paper, you had silk paper, you had cotton paper, you had all kinds of paper. And so people would use certain kinds of paper for certain kinds of things. And Dart realized that this was a paper that he used for a letter. So what did he do? They stopped the trial and they say, we are going to go find out what happened. And so they go down the street in Brazoria County and they find two chemists. Two chemists try the paper. They start looking at it, they inspect it, they do their little chemical things with it, and they say, oh yes, this is not the first time this paper was used, because when you were washing paper back then with benzene and bleach, it would leave faint little lines underneath what was written on top. And so if you looked in there, you could see that there had been something else written. So the chemists came to trial and they said this had been washed and rewritten. Still, all of Texas loved Monroe. They said, that's not our problem. If Dart thinks that he lives in the millennium and he needs to recycle his paper, what's that to us? If he wants to do that, that's not our problem. Bottom line is he signed that document. So what happens after that? Monroe gets a little upset, but not too much. But the judge never buys it. And the judge says, I don't believe any of this. I'm going to go ahead and arrest Monroe for forgery. So he arrests him. And they have a little picture of him arrested. They arrest him and they put him in jail. They also arrest his brother, but they let him go. So what did he do? He took, where am I? Okay, so this is what he actually did. This is how he did the crime. There was a low-level gambler who looked very, very much like Christopher Dart. And Monroe went up to him and said, look, I'm going to hire you. We're going to go down to Galveston at the Tremont. Yes, the Tremont. And you're going to pretend to be Christopher Dart. I'm going to give you this forged bill of sale. You're going to hang on to it. I'm going to go get my brother and some friends. We're going to stage a fake meeting, and you're going to come in, and you're going to hand me this bill of sale, and you're going to tell me that we're good, and I have just sold you Chenango. So that's what happened. It's exactly what happened. And there's a picture of the Tremont Hotel. Not at the same time, but just a picture of the Tremont Hotel for you. So this happened right over in Galveston. Now, what didn't they expect? When Monroe is taken to, when Monroe is arrested, everyone starts talking about it. And Monroe did not expect for anyone to actually see Mr. Dart. So what actually happened was, the clerk was upstairs. Once the story reaches Galveston, he's sitting there and he's thinking, yeah, I saw Mr. Dart up in his room. He had all his clothes, he was in his underwear. And then I ran down to go back to work, and lo and behold, I see him walk in the door. I never put it all together, but now I know that was a fake Mr. Dart. So that's what happened. He did not expect anyone to actually see Mr. Dart, but that was what was wrong in his whole game. Now Monroe didn't realize this when he was in jail, but he does when he goes to get his bond in San Antonio. I know that sounds very strange to you, but back then, we were so trusting. You're in your jail, and two things happened to Mr. Dart that we probably would never let happen today. First, a little girl named Kitty Clover dressed herself up as a little slave boy named Henry. And little Miss Kitty Clover goes up to the guard and says, "I want to see my master." So they open the thing up. The little slave boy, Kitty Clover, goes inside. Monroe says, "Can I keep my slave boy with me?" He says, "Sure." Lock up the door. So now he is with Kitty Clover in the jail cell. That's the first thing. We're like, really? Yeah. Second thing is this. If you wanted to go get bond somewhere else with your attorney, the attorney would come on his little horse, and they would get you a horse, and you would get on your horse, and you'd get your slave boy on her horse, and you would all go over to San Antonio. And you would meet with a judge, and the judge would give you a bond, and then you would get on your horse, and you would come back. So they're on their way to San Antonio. Monroe knows something is up because he's been arrested and he needs to figure out what went wrong. So he tells Kitty Clover, "Go back to Brazoria. I'm going to make up a story for you to go back so that my attorneys don't have any issues with it. And you're going to go around town and you're going to figure out what does everybody know." So she does that as he's going off to San Antonio. She comes back and she says, "Everybody knows everything." And he says, "Oh no, this is not good." Here's a lovely picture of him with Kitty Clover. So this is what they do. He takes Kitty Clover and he says, "We're not going back to Brazoria because I'm going to be hung for forgery." So they escape in the night on their horses. They leave Texas. They never return. Nobody in Texas within probably 3 to 6 weeks after that believes anything about Monroe Edwards. He is a complete exile from the entire state. And he goes to the northeast coast. He ends up back in England where he again swindles Princess Diana's ancestors. He comes back over the pond, goes to New York where he swindles the first investment bank of the United States of America, a bank that still exists today. He is found guilty of counterfeit and swindling in that case, and he is sentenced to Sing Sing where he tries to escape, and he is found and beaten so severely that he ends up dying and being buried in an unmarked grave at Sing Sing. And that is the story of how an international crime spree began right down the road in Brazoria, Texas. So if anybody wants to talk about Texas or what they thought, you just let me know because there's more. That's a lot of story to digest.
Have you tried to sell this to Netflix?
No.
At least 3 seasons right there.
Yeah. Well, there's so much to that, but I think it's probably, that's one of the reasons that probably the guys in Brazoria are so enamored with him because there is so much going on, and it's a true story.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm able to document all of that. Well, maybe the part about the opera woman, but definitely had a diamond ring, so, you know. But I tend to think that's probably exactly what happened because in the culture of Britain at that time, it was very common to have affairs as long as you were discreet about it. That's in the book too. So anyway, but anyhow, that's the story. So thank you very much for letting me tell you about it.
Laura has books if anyone's interested in having her sign for you.